Hello. Good afternoon. In a moment, I'll introduce Mitch more formally. Thank you for being here. In full disclosure, I haven't climbed Everest.
If that was the presentation you were hoping for,
or anything close to that, you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed. If I can get up 10 or 15 stairs every day, that's my Everest. So thank you for being here. I'd like to introduce Mitch Viner. Mitch is General Counsel for Core Media, and Mitch is going to talk about, he's our customer, and he's going to talk, one of the things we're going to talk about today is the journey of taking a customer, we're a provider, technology provider, and taking a customer through the SMS process, through the compliance thought process. So we hope you have a lot of questions at the end, and we'll get going. We're going to have a seat. I'm going to go through the background of SMS a little bit up front. We'll talk about Mitch's journey and his pain points as our customer, the things he thinks about, and we'll open it up for some questions later. Okay? Thank you for coming. So as I mentioned, my name is Ken Richard. I'm EVP and General Counsel at Ytel. We are a technology provider located in Foothill Ranch, California. We are a CPaaS company, and that stands for Communication Platform as a Service. So we provide different technologies in order for customers or allow customers to communicate with their clientele or their stakeholders, whoever it might be. There are several different channels that we provide. Voice, SMS is really the topic today, and also different types of broadcasting technology. So if you're doing that now or have interest in that, we can certainly help you and talk to you about that. We are very compliance-centric. Unlike a lot of the industries out there, we really like to help our customers, as I hope Mitch will say.
Wait for the payoff at the end.
Yeah, at the end. Walk through the process and guide through the compliance process. And unlike voice in the old days where you just had to make sure someone wasn't on a do not call list, it's a little bit more complex with SMS, not only from a regulatory perspective, but from a carrier perspective as well. The carriers, what I mean by carriers are the T-Mobiles, the big four, T-Mobile, Verizon, Sprint, and AT&T. And they're starting to block traffic if they don't like the traffic. We're not going to go into a whole lot of detail about that today, but compliance, you're all here on a compliance conference, is getting a little bit more complex as time goes on. So we're here to talk about that, at least at a very high level, and of course we're available after to talk to you about any and all of this stuff if you'd like, and we'll take questions at the end. So just a brief history about SMS, just a shameless pitch for the technology. It's clearly the most effective way to communicate today with your clients or customers, whoever it might be, your existing customers. And I'd like to raise your hand if there's anyone here that does not have a cell phone. Raise your hand. Not one. We all have cell phones. Every one of us has a cell phone. And I would ask you at this point to take out your cell phone if you could do that, if you don't mind, if it's handy. If not, that's okay. So go ahead to your texting app. If you have an iPhone, you know how to do that. I'm an iPhone guy. I don't know how to do it on an Android device. But go to your texting app and to the number 411411, go ahead and text Ken, my name, K-E-N, to 411411. And I'll give you just a moment to do that. I'm seeing people looking up. So by now, depending on your network, you should have my contact information. So that's a simple example of the use of SMS in an engagement or a communication with a group with whom you want to communicate. So the 411411 is called a short code. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, the difference between a long code and a short code. But the point I'm trying to make is the use of SMS is ubiquitous today, and it's becoming more and more so as time goes on, and will continue for several years going forward. Now, the type of SMS may change. There are different technologies that are evolving. There's a technology called RCS, which is being developed jointly by Google, and we're involved with it and other companies, that will make the texting app much more robust. So as much use as it is today, it's going to be much more useful in the future because app use is actually projected to go down a little bit, because the robustness, if you will, of the SMS platform is going to increase. You'll be able to do more within that application itself. So it's a really great technology. We all look at our phones. We all get a little rush when we see someone texted us, usually. Sometimes it's not always the greatest thing, but the point is no one answers their phone, or fewer people answer their phone anymore or use email anymore. I'm not slamming phone, voice, or email, but let's face it, it's changed. So we're here to talk to you about that, and we want to get you on the right path and at least thinking about compliance because it's a little more complex than normal. So a little bit of the history of SMS. The first text message was sent in 1992, and if you heard me speak before, please don't shout out, but what was the first text message ever sent? Any guesses? It wasn't LOL. It was Merry Christmas. So there, you got another piece of trivia that you can put in your quiver.
Did not know that.
You didn't know that. Now you know.
There you go.
And we've talked a lot.
That's
you didn't
right.
know that. Okay. So as time goes on, remember Nokia really dominated the marketplace with phones years ago, right? And that was really the phone. And as time went on, between keyboards and all those types of things, things evolved. And back in 1995, the average American sent less than a half a text per month. Well, that's not true anymore, is it? So as time goes on, I want to run through this pretty quickly. Nokia creates a keyboard in 1997. By 2000, average of 35 SMS per month. So you see it's kind of exponentially changing. This shouldn't be news to anybody. And the watershed moment in 2007 where texting surpassed phone calls. That trend is going to continue. And today, roughly, Americans send an average of about 2,100 SMS per month. And if you have a teenager, you can add a 0 at the end of that number, as you well know. So, the point is very clear. SMS is continuing. It's got to be part of your ecosystem or you're going to be behind because your competitors are using it. So we talked about why SMS. I'll do this very quickly. 22 billion texts. This stat just blows me away. 95% of texts are read within 5 minutes after it's sent. 95%. Where do you get that kind of exposure, right? People don't pick up the phone unless they know who it is today. Email, we all use email, probably not as much as we did in the past. We don't like it as much as we did in the past. Still necessary for sure. But texting is really becoming very, very ubiquitous, and it's used. 95%. You don't get that type of response. We're texting a lot more than we're calling. No surprise to anybody. We talk about in a lead gen space, for instance, 90% of leads want to be communicated that way. We like it. We drop our car off to get the oil change. We like knowing when it's ready. Those types of things. We like texting. It's convenient for us. And it's nearly guaranteed to be seen by your audience. I suspect a lot of you are here because you're doing texting. You have maybe some uneasiness about whether you're doing it correctly. So we're hopefully going to address some of those issues. I mentioned earlier, and I want to get through this quickly, long code, short code. The 411 and 411 is called a short code. That's that funny little number that Amazon sent you to tell you that your package has been shipped. Your CVS, your prescription's ready. Those are short codes. They're not phone numbers. A long code is a phone number. So when you're sending a text to somebody else, back and forth, that's called a long code. So the short codes and the long codes have different uses depending on what your application is, and we can go into a little more detail with that later. And there are different rules, actually, for using short code and long code. As I mentioned, the long code's a 10-digit number. It's great for just conversational type of traffic back and forth. It's two-way communication. Compliance. So here's why we're here. So why don't we just, if you're a marketer, why don't you just start blasting random phone numbers? Well, we can't do that, obviously, right? TCPA applies to texting just as it does for phone calls. So we have to follow the rules or we're going to get in trouble. And I'm the guy that sits in the middle of that. I sit in the middle of the customer and the FT, and I hope I never get something from, I'm sure I won't because these guys are really good. But I sit in the middle of the customer and the FTC and the FCC when I get subpoenas. They want to know who's sending the texting because there's a problem. And onesie and twosies aren't a big deal, but if there's a serial violator, they get really uptight. And then you have the class action predatory plaintiff lawyers. And that's a whole different breed of cat, as maybe some of you know. But we know how to handle them, at least we think we do at this point. So basically, for texting, we're talking about some different agencies. The CTIA you see there and the MMA are industry associations which have set rules on how to text, when you can text, how to do it, what the content of the message can and can't be. The acronym that we have talked about in the past is SHAFT, sex, hate, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. If your messaging has anything to do with any of that, that's a bad thing. They're going to shut you down on the industry standard. They don't want you talking about that stuff, right? Now, on a phone call, it's very different. You pick up a call and someone calls somebody, you have a conversation. Texting is very different because they can screen for those types of things. And others, by the way. It's not limited to SHAFT. The FTC is probably the most active regulatory body that I encounter, much more than the FTC and the FCC. The FTC is more involved with truthful advertising, making sure there's no misleading information sent out by text, that type of thing. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. The FCC is more concerned with TCPA. And you've heard of TCPA. It's the regulation that regulates texting and phone calling, and when you can call, when you can't call, particularly with regard to the big word is opt-in, right? You got to have opt-in, and there are rules surrounding that. So the FTC and the FCC are typically the federal regulatory agencies that cover this topic, and CTIA and MNMA are the industry associations, and we're a carrier also. Whitetail is an actual carrier, phone carrier. So we work closely in that association with the carriers as well to make sure that we're doing the right thing. We want good compliant traffic for our customers. Good traffic, good compliant traffic is good business. It's good business for everyone. And we really emphasize that in our company. Just some really quick tips about opt-in. A couple things you got to do. You probably know this already. And if anyone wants this slide deck, I'm happy to send it to you. If you come over to our booth, we'll make sure you get an electronic version of this later. You want to have clear opt-in mechanisms, and there are many ways to do that. Have written opt-in. Mitch will probably talk to you about that a little bit, if you could, in a moment. They must expressly give written consent to that opt-in. You have to be able to hang on to that, have a mechanism in order to hang on to that, so that if someone comes calling down the road, that you have the ability to say, well, they opted in, right? There's nothing wrong with texting on a mass basis as long as you have opt-in. It's not a boogeyman like a lot of people think. A lot of people are afraid of it, and you don't need to be afraid of it if you're going by the rules. You'd like to send an opt-in confirmation, opt-out confirmation. We all know that if we're getting a text from someone, sometimes, I think my optician reminded me, or optometrist reminded me I needed an appointment, and I went to somebody else, so I opted out of that. So I don't get those messages anymore. And no one saw that text. I mean, it was very clean. I wasn't mad about it. Just I hit stop, and that was done. I got a confirmation text that said, you've opted out. If you'd like to opt back in, do whatever. And it was great. Didn't have to talk to anybody. People like texting. Some more just high-level tips. We can talk to you in more detail and kind of get into the weeds a little bit later if you'd like. You want to make sure you're acknowledging opt-outs. So give them a little bit of security about what it is you're trying, so they know they're not going to sit there and get more text down the road. It's nice to get an acknowledgement. You want to provide a help option. These are just a couple of high-level things that we suggest that you're doing in texting campaigns. So opt-in requirements. Businesses who intend to send SMS for marketing purposes need to do a few things before enrolling people. They include, time preferences, right? So between certain times, it's like calling. You can't call after a certain time. It applies to text messaging as well. And whether you're doing business with us or another provider, you want to make sure that technology base has the ability to make sure those parameters can be set so texting isn't done in times that you're not supposed to do it, because that's what it's going to get you in trouble, right? We call it the time zone protection feature. This is one feature of many to make sure you're doing things compliantly. At Whitetail, shameless plug, we move forward with this as a service. Our offering isn't just giving you the platform and saying you're on your own, good luck. We like to help you manage through your whole program, give you advice on compliance, the do's and the don'ts, the boarding process. Mitch will talk about that in a moment. We've been doing this a few months now, trying to make sure everything's right at Mitch's company, and he'll give some color on that. But that's how we feel we differentiate ourselves from our competitors. And so there are Fortunately, I don't want to spend a lot of time with this. Just to summarize really quick, SMS preferred communication, personalized communication, long code, short code, depending on your application. And we can provide all kinds of use cases for you for sales, marketing, or operations. So with that, I'm going to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind, Mitch. So why don't you tell the crowd who you are and who you represent
Sure.
and who your client companies are and how did we all get together?
Sure. So just like the trip up Everest, I'm going to go back before we can go forward. So I'm with Core Digital Media, and we are one of the largest display and search advertisers. Some of the brands that you would know is, of course, Lower My Bills. We're also part of the family of companies through RHA Holdings, which includes Quicken Loans, Rocket Mortgage, and the brands that Rhonda represents.
Rhonda, would you like to say hello to everyone who's sitting here? Rhonda's the compliance officer for Quicken.
That's right.
So we're delighted she's here with us today.
That's right.
Thank you.
We have the opportunity to reach millions of consumers every year through those existing channels. And we do it organically. So we're not buying lists, we're not buying traffic. We're finding original, unique consumers. And a big question is, what can you do with them? How do you reach them? What's the most effective way to present them these opportunities? And our perspective at Lower My Bills is that we want to reach the consumer where they are and provide them targeted, relevant opportunities speaking to the phase of their financial life that they're presently in, right? You can have a great ad, but if you're not reaching that consumer when they're in market or they have an interest, it doesn't matter how snappy or clicky that text is, right? You have to have a good ad, and it has to be transparent as to the advertiser. It has to have the appropriate disclosures. It has to not be misleading, but it has to be relevant, and it has to reach them at a time where they can act on that. So, as I said, we already have this consumer base. To Ken's point, we're already observing things like TCPA. We already have appropriate disclosures on our website. So you have this huge pool of consumers, and you want to talk to them. And part of the magic of SMS, as you all experienced with the 411, is the opportunity to provide timely, targeted messaging. If 60% of those consumers out there are going to be on a mobile device, whether that's in-app or just doing some other functionality, and as Ken indicated, they're going to see it. That's a powerful tool. You, as an advertiser, you can't walk away from that, and so you then have a responsibility of how do you construct messaging that's relevant? How do you deliver it in a way that's compliant? And that was part of our outreach with Ytel, which was we have in-house experience dealing with whether it's FTC regulations, mortgage regulations, but for us, the mobile messaging environment was new. And candidly, we didn't want to spend the next year sort of getting through the ins and outs of how to deal with the carrier associations or the idiosyncrasies of individual regulators or carrier reviewers, I guess, that would be determining what type of messaging content was appropriate in mobile, what wasn't, the format, that individual carriers have their own idiosyncrasies about what messages have high deliverability versus low deliverability. And so the great appeal of working with Ytel was the slide, I think it was about 2 slides back, that talked about message design, implementation, sort of oversight of the scope of the messaging campaign. Because we had the tool set, we had the consumer set, we wanted to find a way to reach them efficiently and in a targeted fashion, which was working with your team.
It's great. And I think offline, Mitch had mentioned to me that this is not an unsophisticated man or group or company. These, we're talking about a lot of years of experience and your experience, and it's still that needed a little bit more specialized knowledge in order to be able to navigate the carriers and the governmental agencies. And you have state agencies as well. It's interesting. I get subpoenas from a lot of different agencies.
Don't brag.
What's that?
Don't brag.
On different.
It's not a contest.
No, it's not. But we send billions of messages in any given month. But the point is, some are more active than others. And I can think of Indiana, Louisiana, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, Kansas, I would say 90% of the subpoenas come from those states. I don't think in 10 years I got one from California. Go figure. Or New York.
I would have guessed New York.
Yeah, or Illinois. I don't know why that is. I don't. It's just these states, and it's the same people, it's the same process, and so some are more active in this type of thing than other states. So there's a little bit of a scheme out there. Where are you in the process now? Where are we in the process for core media?
So core digital has some unique characteristics because the type of messaging that we're dealing with, like many people that's sitting in this room, has to do with financial services. So that's its own very, very specialized animal when it comes to mobile messaging. I'll segue from your question for a moment and throw that, whether it's a shameless pitch or just context of what types of industries does Ytel cover with respect to messaging?
We're industry agnostic. It doesn't matter. So anytime an industry or someone has a need to communicate with its customer base, it could be, we don't, but we could be carrying all of CVS's traffic or Amazon's traffic, right? But we have many large names who you would know. So it's a very, very large, remember, it's communication. It doesn't matter what the industry is. Now, some have more regulations like financial than others, right? So if you're selling solar, if you go to a Lions game in Detroit, and you'll see on the billboard, text solar to 411-411. That's a typical marketing thing, but that's one example. And by the way, all of us have seen commercials on TV or heard on the radio, text something to this funny number, right? That's one way to implement this process. It's the simplest way to implement this process. But that's the idea. But to answer your question, Mitch, it's industry agnostic.
And so for your question, where we are in the process is we've obviously been working with Ytel's account representatives, engineers. We have a team that's working actually specifically with our product development team so that we can incorporate one of the principles that another speaker said yesterday, which I wrote down. And I'll pause for a moment as a shameless plug for this concept because I just was moved by it, which was this idea that rather than have compliance be an adversary off to the side of the business, that the way you incorporate a culture of compliance is if you're built into the business. And maybe we just talk about that here, but I'm certainly an evangelist on the idea that compliance done right can be good for business. It's sometimes a hard sell, there's no doubt about it. But I'll tell you, in this environment now, whether it's TCPA or dealing with regulators, whether it's mortgage, fintech, or within mobile messaging, the stakes are so high that even when you do the simplest cost-benefit analysis, it's just bad to get it wrong. It's always bad to get it wrong, but it's now more expensive than ever to get it wrong. So part of what we're doing with Ytel is we are actually in the short code process. Down the road, we're going to explore the long code because we'd like to engage a consumer, as you say, in a conversation. We're not there yet. We have to walk before we can run. So we're working with product engineers. We're working with the account team to develop messaging, to develop the application process so that we don't trip over ourselves, to make sure that the terms and conditions that we use, which are already compliant for the laws that we're familiar with, speak to a regulator in a way that they're used to hearing it. And that's a difference that I would point out, which is, like I said, I've dealt with state AGs, we've dealt with agencies that I won't name now for fear of jinxing myself, but we haven't dealt with the AT&Ts and the Verizons of the world. And what we want to leverage is the Ytel experience to say, hey, you might think that this is compliant language, but what they're really looking for is something that speaks to this concern or that concern. So I don't think your guys have parking spaces in our building, but we've certainly validated some parking. So.
Yes, you have in mind. Thank you for that, by the way. And to Mitch's point about the carriers, no one really thinks about the carriers that much. Again, it's not like voice where you just place a call, whether you do it on a voice broadcast basis or you're dialing or however you're using a dialer, whatever it might be, plugging into your CRM. And by the way, we can integrate probably with all your CRMs. Some trickiness with that, but typically we can integrate with any CRM at some level. There's obviously some work to do with some of that, but that's the way to do it. But on the carrier side, it's important. It's an important point, and I don't want it to be lost on that. You could be sending 1 million messages, 2 million messages. If they're not being delivered, if they're not terminating, you're wasting your time and money, and a lot of times you don't even know they're not being terminated. So one of the value adds that we provide is we know the carriers very well, we know the aggregators very well, and if there's an issue with traffic, we typically know pretty quickly. We know before the customer knows, and to try to pivot at that point in time. So your traffic is getting delivered, and you're getting your money's worth of what you're paying for on the traffic. So it's very different than voice, and it's evolving all the time.
I'll say it's also very different from sort of our display, email, or search type of campaigns. Something that we've discovered over time working with your team is that you're always tempted to go with what works, right? And I'd ask the Perform line folks of, hey, what are you seeing in say social media? Because we had the same issues whether it's Twitter or Instagram. You think you have this magic headline because it works in display, and then you run it in Instagram or you run it as a mobile message, and you find out that the cadence of that message is just wrong. Speaking of cadence, that's some other things that we talked about. You mentioned the time of sending the message, but other things that we're exploring, which all of you should go find out about, are things like just the cadence of sending, your overall daily or weekly volume. You should be thinking about distribution across multiple carriers. Different carriers have different tolerances for how much volume you can push at a particular time, how much volume you can push with the same messaging, the cadence of changing your messaging. Once again, from a display or an email perspective, if you have headlines or ad copy that's successful, well, you will beat that horse to death until your performance falls off. But you very quickly find out, and this frankly wasn't something we thought about until conversations with your team, we didn't really think about the fact that carriers were looking at that just substantively differently. So, when you talk about why not build it yourself or why not do it yourself, it's just stuff that sure our consumer experience team would find out maybe after getting it wrong for 6 months, in which case I've wasted all those impressions, I've burned through those consumers, I've spent the money to send, and it's something to consider in terms of your ROI, that now you would perhaps look at a campaign and say, why are we in mobile? It's not cost effective, or it doesn't have a good conversion rate. Well, really what you're doing is you're stepping on your own feet. And you wouldn't find that out without knowing some of these elements.
And how competitive business is today. If you're not doing it, your competitor is or will be. So it's something you really need to be very cognizant about, because again, I asked everyone, does anyone not have a cell phone? Not one person raised their hand. And everyone has cell phones, no news there. You didn't come here to hear that, you already know that. But I just want to emphasize that point. We've got 2 minutes, so we can take a few calls. You
can text him your questions.
Yeah. You can text me.
Answer the 41141.
Take a few calls. No pun intended. Really wasn't intended. Any questions at this point in time? And we'll be around, so we'll be happy to talk to you. If we missed a topic or a question you might have had, we're happy to drill down on that for you and help you out as much as we can. Yes, sir.
Are there certain exclusions where you can send after hours to what TCK says don't send, but we do a lot of live webinars and like a disclaimer, can we just have our disclaimer that says you'll receive SMS after 9 p.m.?
In law, and Mitch will tell you this, you never say never, but it's not a good practice. And off the top of my head, I've been practicing law 30 years. I would say emergency situations, you'd probably get a pass on something like that. But an emergency sale that you're having for your company probably wouldn't pass that type of scrutiny. Things of that nature, I don't know if you can think of anything.
I wouldn't be giving this as legal advice. I'd say a marketing message would be different than a confirmation message for a specific event, or again, if you're having a conversation with that consumer versus sort of an a marketing blast would be different.
Right.
Yeah.
When it comes to setting time zone parameters with people living all over the country and moving and cell phones going everywhere, do you recommend calling based on area code or zip code?
I'm going to ask Steve that question. Did you hear the question? Would you mind? Yes, sir.
For the do not call list, it gets a little weird because you have to register with the FCC to get access to the do not call list.
If you want to scrub against it,
Yeah. So is that literally needed if you're not doing robocalls, you're not doing voice messages, just an SMS sends like every 30 days, you always scrub it against that do not call list?
well, if you have consent opt-in, you're good, right? So if they specifically opt into your campaign, that will supersede their DNC because they're waiving basically their right not to be called. And we're probably all on the DNC list, right? But we still love letting know our oil change, our car's ready, and we love knowing the prescription's ready or whatever it might be. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, absolutely.
So we work with publishers often, and if you're sending out a message that talks about one offer, but then also provides a number to call our company, do you have to mention both names within that message, or what's kind of the best practice?
The opt-in has to, and I'm just going to give you the general rule, and it can be nuanced. The general rule is that they're opting in for a specific subject matter, right? So if there's a number associated with this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, then you're okay. But what you can't do is get an opt-in and then just sell the lead to a million different people or go in 100 different directions, and they think they're opting in for something they didn't intend to opt in. So just think consent. Think of informed consent, if you will. That's probably a pretty good analogy for it.
I always draw that back to TCPA, with specific seller, specific purpose. You can do other things, but and actually it ties back to your question too, which is look at the language of your disclosure, look at the language of your consent, and follow the scope of that. So.
Yes, sir. We got. I don't know. I think you're winning.
So I don't know if this is a myth or not, but like I've been told, like you need to keep examples of your disclaimer used, collect the names for 4 years. Like lawsuits can go back 4 years once you collected that name. Like, do you guys that you do with your company, like keep examples of SMS sites?
We keep them forever. But yes, and in fact, I will just tell you, not in the SMS context, but certainly within TCPA, we've had incidents. We have records of our forms and our disclosures going back probably at least the exemplar versions to the beginning of time. But you can be sure since 2013, we keep everything because we've had claims go back some number of years, even though a consumer had consented explicitly.
There's nothing more disheartening to a plaintiff's lawyer, class action lawyer, than when you whip out the consent and say your class representative consented on this date. It's a beautiful thing to. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh. Right. So that's a great question, and I know that a lot of what we do on that side is driven by our client base. So we have a data warehouse where we do keep all of that. Now, what we don't do, I am being played off the stage. I'd like to accept my Academy Award, and wow. Short answer, we go by what clients are using, and we have our own data warehouse, but it is something that's relevant that you should look into.
Okay, one last thing. We're going to go start training for Everest tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're good.
But
so come talk
please
to
enjoy
us.
the music.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been great. Thank you so much.